Very welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us. This is, people will be coming in, so we'll just give it a second. We are doing this as a blended session, just a Just Transition. So there is online participants and there's people in this room, in our studio here in WeCreate Centre in the Ecovillage. My name's Davy Phillip. I'm both an Ecovillage member and work with Sustainable Ireland Cooperative. And this event this morning is following on from a report we've just launched this week, which is called Rural Ireland on the Move, Farm Diversification and Just Transition. And today we're doing two events. This morning, the Just Transition event, and this afternoon we're going into diversification, farm and rural diversification. And these events are supported by the Irish Environmental Network and feed into our annual Feeding Ourselves weekend. So tomorrow we have a physical and blended event for the emerging regenerative, cooperative, local, community-led food sector. And today's events sort of feed into that. So today we have a number of speakers and an opportunity for capturing reflections and observations. And we have a plenary where we'll discuss how we might accelerate just transition in the way that we've framed it in the report, and we'll hear from the speakers who will give a bit of an introduction to the report. I'm going to put the report into the chat just so people can access it if they haven't accessed it. It's a large report and this is the launch. So welcome everyone. I'll just again now properly open. So I'm Davy Phillip. I'm this morning facilitating on behalf of Sustainable Projects Ireland, the educational charity that are developing the Ecovillage. And we're hosting this event from our digital studio in the WeCreate workspace in Cloughjordan Ecovillage. We're going to have a number of speakers today, starting off with Michelle Carey, who will give us an overview of the report, and then we'll go into a short presentation from Padder Kirby, from the Ecovillage. I'll introduce everyone as they come in. Caroline White then from FASTA, Oliver Moore from Art 2020, also an Ecovillager and working here in WeCreate. Oliver will look at the new threats to just transition, bring it into agriculture. We'll have Bridget Murphy and Fintan Kelly and giving some short pieces there about the just transition in agriculture. Then we have Olive McCarthy, Beyond Farming, a just transition to energy efficiency for low-income households. And then Lawrence Fulham, who will be just giving some insights on what's been left out of the just transition process so far and what maybe communities can offer. So that's a sort of shape. We might just get started right away with Michelle Carey. Michelle Carey has been working with Lenny Antonelli on this report. And so over to Michelle.
Hi everyone. I'll just make sure that I'm looking at the camera and everything. Hi everyone, my name is Michelle. I was the primary author for this report with support and contributions from Ollie Moore, Matteo Metta and Lenny Antonelli, and thank you to Davy Phillip as well and Oscar Mooney for weighing in. Firstly, thank you to ARC 2020 and UCC's Centre for Cooperative Studies for funding this research to support these events. It's great to have a shared foundation to work from when bringing people together to have conversations like these. And thank you to Sustainable Projects Ireland and Cultivate for hosting us here in Cloughjordan Ecovillage. And thank you to everyone as well for being here today. I'm looking forward to hearing a lot of different voices and ideas. And I think that the people in this room and virtual room have a lot in common and a lot of shared values like supporting and invigorating rural communities in Ireland, ensuring that no one is left behind when it comes to climate action, imagining a vision of Ireland where farmers and rural communities prosper, and making sure that we have a healthy landscape around us and we're producing healthy and good food. It was January when we started researching and writing this report on just transition and rural diversification, which is only about 4 months ago now, but it feels like about a decade of change has happened between now and then. And as we were compiling the report, a lot was changing and progressing nationally and internationally, particularly with the war in Ukraine, food security concerns, and the cost of living crisis. So keeping up with all of that was challenging, but it also showed that there is a lot happening at the moment in terms of ensuring a just transition, and I felt even more confident that what we were working on was relevant and urgent and important. I also just want to mention that there's so much involved in just transition as a topic, and there's so much pertinent work out there that it was impossible to include everything, and I'm sure we missed out on including some people and perspectives that we should have, and maybe even some things that have changed recently, but just so hopefully we can mention those in the discussion today. Just a bit about me, so you know who's talking to you. In the past, I've worked in promoting sustainable transport and in nature conservation, and I completed an MSc in sustainable environments in NUI Galway in 2020. My focus has shifted to agriculture and food, and I'm working on an organic horticulture farm in the Midlands. I was really excited and intrigued when I was asked to work on this report, and I've really enjoyed the process of putting it together. The process of putting the report together involved reviewing available research papers, articles, and reports that focused on or referred to just transition, primarily in Ireland. There are a lot of people and groups out there at the moment doing very interesting and extremely valuable in-depth research on this topic. So our goal was to look broadly at what's out there and to identify common threads and common topics that recurred in the research. Some of these common topics, I'm sure, will inform our discussion today. Then, to add more depth to the report, we got in touch with farmers, agricultural organizations, think tanks, researchers, and people who work in the area of just transition to ask them to contribute their perspectives on the topic. We've included the responses that we received in the report. So Ireland is a small country, and we punch above our weight in a lot of ways. Our influence on culture and sport across the world is obvious, and we regularly exceed expectations in those categories and more. But unfortunately, we also punch above our weight when it comes to our carbon footprint. In 2019, Ireland's emissions of greenhouse gases per capita were 53% higher than the EU 28 average, and the second highest in the EU, with Luxembourg being the only country ahead of us. So I don't think we want second place in this category, and I hope that we can address this position that we found ourselves in. The 2021 Climate Act commits Ireland to reducing our overall greenhouse gas emissions by 51% by 2030, and to achieving a climate resilient, biodiversity rich and carbon neutral economy by no later than the end of the year 2050. So if we plan to achieve this, we'll need to restructure and reshape all sectors of our society and economy. And even though targets like 2030 and 2050 make it feel like we have a few years to sort ourselves out, the climate crisis is here now, and the recent IPCC report tells us that we only have a narrow window of time left to avoid the worst case scenarios. So being here today and discussing ways to move forward is great, and hopefully we can finish up this meeting later with a sense of forward momentum. Just to speak broadly and set the context for our discussion, many of you may know that the term just transition sprung up initially from the labour movement, meaning that no workers' livelihoods should suffer or be sacrificed as a result of broader policy changes. So now the term just transition has become a core part of climate action, meaning that no person, community or sector of society should be left behind or even sacrificed in Ireland's transition to a carbon neutral society. As the Just Transition Alliance wrote in their contribution to the report, a just transition is required to protect and create jobs, reduce emissions, enhance living standards and generate new opportunities that will help build sustainable, resilient communities across the country. A just transition also provides the effective means to safeguard and restore biodiversity at a national and international level. And when moving toward a carbon neutral economy in Ireland, we need to ensure that certain regions, communities and people and sectors are not unfairly left behind in the process. A just transition is essential for climate action. If we are to encourage support for climate action, we'll need to ensure that people feel that it is a fair and positive process where people are brought along rather than left behind. So far in Ireland, the focus of a Just Transition has been on ending commercial peat harvesting by Bord na Móna and retraining the staff who lost jobs in this change up so that they can be retrained and employed in roles like peatland rehabilitation. A Just Transition Commissioner was appointed, Kieran Mulvey, to coordinate and oversee this. The idea of ending commercial peat harvesting and retraining staff is great, as bogs are incredibly important carbon stores and also integral to Irish culture. But there has been some criticism that maybe this process isn't going as efficiently as planned. And in any case, this process should be as clear and transparent to the public if it is to be part of a Just Transition. There's also a lot of funding out there for Just Transition at the moment, with approximately €120 million having gone towards the end of peat harvesting. And in the National Just Transition Fund as well, in 2020, there was a total of 20.5 million of grant funding awarded to projects in that fund. And after looking through the recipients, it was clear that there were very few recipients in food and agriculture. And I'm not sure whether that Just Transition funding was made available to the ag sector through other means, but I tried to contact the Just Transition Commissioner office about it, but I didn't get an answer back on that. So more funding is coming through Ireland's draft territorial Just Transition plan as well, and this will unlock €84 million of funding from the EU Just Transition Fund, according to the Irish government. So there was an online public consultation there a few months ago, which I attended, and I got the impression that from the people facilitating that they were kind of surprised that I was there as a citizen rather than as representing a sector or a company. So thinking about these inclusive public consultations and some how to incorporate feedback from people who are supposed to be receiving this funding, I think will be incredibly important moving forward in Just Transition. So I'll briefly mention some of the recurring themes I saw coming up in Just Transition in our Just Transition research. One of them was a capabilities approach, meaning that individuals, businesses, and communities should be empowered to achieve well-being and to pursue results that they can value. I think that's a really important point, realizing and respecting that some communities may value or be more equipped to take on certain actions over others, and certain actions may be more urgent than others too. A bespoke approach to a Just Transition also came up consistently. Changes will need to be place-based and context-specific. What's going to work in the northwest of Ireland won't necessarily work in the southeast, and even within those areas there may be nuances. The report touches on policy interventions as well, and the potential of CAP to influence a Just Transition, as it defines what happens with farming in the EU to a large extent. And then thinking about things like consumer interventions, not just producers, will be an important part of our Just Transition process too. The think tank task argues that interventions like a 4-day work week and the implementation of a living wage will help people when it comes to making decisions about purchasing food, good food, and improving affordability of good food. And lastly, enhancing the value captured by farmers for their products is another recurring theme that came up. From the research available, it seems that Ireland's farmers capture less of the economic food chain than their European counterparts. So as it stands, there's a lot more clarity and analysis needed there on that value chain if we can ensure fairness and consistency there. So finally, just to say, Sinead Mercier, a Just Transition researcher, wrote that there is no ready-made template of how a successful completed transition to a zero carbon economy. We're figuring out the way forward now, and hopefully this discussion today can shed some more light on the process and on the way forward. Thank you for listening to me go on, and I'll hand you back to Davy.
Thanks, Michelle. That was a really nice insight and overview of the report. So the report now is available for people to download on the ARC website, Rural Ireland on the Move. And now we're going to hear some of the voices that were in that report to help shape our conversation in the plenary. So I'm going to hand over first to Peadar Kirby. Peadar is an educator, an author, and former academic. He's the former professor of international politics at the University of Limerick, and he is a resident of Cloughjordan Ecovillage. So you're very welcome, Peadar.
Thank you, Davy. So if we could see my slides there, can people see them? Oscar, you're going to put them up, are you? What I'm concerned about is that the definition and the discussion about the just transition in Ireland, I suppose, it's grown out of the issue with Bord na Móna bogs in the Midlands and how to retrain people. Michelle has told us that there are now efforts to broaden it out, but I think it's very important to see how that happens. And to me, both of the words are very important, because we really don't know how it's going to be just if we are not clear about what sort of transition we're making. And so I entitled this a degrowth transition that prioritizes human flourishing, because it does seem to me that those are the parameters of how we need to look at the nature of the transition. Then we start looking at how we make it just. So if we can go on to the next slide. So I thought that it would be interesting to look at the 4 principles in the Climate Action Plan and to interrogate them somewhat. So the first one there, as you see in the right-hand column, is an integrated, structured, and evidence-based approach to identify and plan our response to just transition requirements. Now, you know, evidence-based policymaking has been spoken a lot about. I was professor of international politics and public policy. It was my field. And I used to always smile to myself because, of course, policymakers pick the evidence that suits them. And there's vast amounts of evidence, and climate change is probably the best example we have, of evidence that simply isn't faced up to by policymakers because it's uncomfortable evidence. So to say it's going to be evidence-based doesn't fill me with confidence, I must say. You know, the evidence is pointing overwhelmingly, it seems to me now, that economic growth remains the main cause of our emissions. And yet all our governments are committed to economic growth. It is the fundamental value that drives them. Every report on the economy is premised on whether it's going to lead to more growth or whether it's leading to less growth. So let's look at evidence around that, and let's bring the degrowth discussion into the focus here, because it seems to me that's fundamental to the sort of transition we need. Then equipping people with the right skills to be able to participate in and benefit from the future net zero economy. Of course, the focus must be on skills of retraining people to be able to get livelihoods. But as we've learned here in Cloughjordan Ecovillage, there are many, many, many more skills. The skills of how you create community, of how you develop a resilient community are just as important as technical skills that people can be trained in. So that's important. And then the third one is, and this is to me the most glaring one, the costs are shared so that the impact is equitable and existing inequalities are not exacerbated. Now, in the next slide, I'll go on to look at inequalities a bit more, but that is really significant because look at the fact that inequality is one of the drivers of the climate crisis. That, as the latest IPCC report highlighted so starkly, that the 50% of the poorest 50% are responsible for about 5 to 10% of the emissions. The top 10% are responsible for about 50% of the emissions. So therefore, addressing that issue is absolutely central to our transition. And yet the third principle of the government's climate action plan is that we don't exacerbate existing inequalities. But existing inequalities are gross and they're a huge part of the problem. And on the right-hand side, you see there a graphic that this also is true in Ireland. So it is the top 1% of the population, the top 10% of the population that are the main culprits for the problem we're in. So if we go on to the next slide to look at another issue that's much under discussion, which is the issue of sustainability. And the IPCC report was very clear that human-induced climate change is a consequence of more than a century of net greenhouse gas emissions from unsustainable energy use and land use change, lifestyle, and patterns of consumption and production. Nothing could be more comprehensive than that in terms of showing it's the whole way in which we organize our society, it's our lifestyles, it's the way in which we use land that are at the heart of the problem. So the transition has to be much more radical than moving away from fossil fuels and to renewable energy. And David Attenborough said it in a quote from his wonderful book, A Life on Our Planet, when he said, I had had a vision of how all human beings had once lived in small groups that found all they needed in the natural world around them. The resources they relied upon were self-renewing, they produced little or no waste, they lived sustainably, in balance with their environment, in a way that could continue effectively forever. As we say in Irish, in Varhanut, far better word than the virtually meaningless word in English, sustainability. Living forever and allowing all of us that share this planet to live forever. So moving to that is going to take far more radical changes than those involved in the very worthy and very positive climate action law and climate action plan, but we need to go much further. I just give a few examples on the right-hand side. I mean, curbing flying is obviously absolutely crucial. Acting on curbing the consumption of the richest 10% and 1%, absolutely vital. But of course, nothing is happening in that regard. End planned obsolescence. Our circular economy law, unfortunately, doesn't decide to do that. Why doesn't the government ban the fact that so many of the products that are made have built-in planned obsolescence? Curbing advertising, it seems to me, is absolutely essential. Advertising drives mindless consumption beyond what any of us need, in this part of the world anyway. To reduce maximum incomes is absolutely essential. To fix a ratio between minimum and maximum incomes isn't part of the policy debate yet, and it's absolutely going to be essential. To shift from ownership to usership is happening in certain sectors, but not in a particularly just way, remember. To end food waste is a huge issue, as we well know, to end all sorts of waste, I mean, plastic in our oceans, for example. And it seems to me the need to decommodify public goods, to expand the commons, to ensure that money doesn't continue to play the central role in keeping our society together. These are just some of the examples of what our transition will need, and how we do that in a just way will have to mean that we focus in on that top 10% and 1% in very sharp and hard-nosed ways. So the next slide, please, Oscar. So degrowth does have to come into the discussion. Degrowth, according to Hickel, is a planned downscaling of energy and resource use. So the downscaling is crucial to bring the economy back into balance with the living world in a safe, just, and equitable way. So bringing the economy and society back into balance with the living world is still a long, long way away. And hopefully the Citizens' Assembly on biodiversity will introduce some real serious thinking about this. It's so badly needed. And where we need to go, the objective of our transition is towards a society that allows everybody to flourish in every part of the world. And that means that we have to move beyond looking at the economy. I mean, do note that our climate action law, the target is a net zero economy. It doesn't tell us anything about the sort of society we need to transition towards. And that's very telling, it seems to me, because we need critically, as I say here, to look at the system that structures our society as well as our economy, even our cultural and spiritual values. And a society that's causing so much suffering, not just to us as a species, but to all the species that we share this planet with. So the transition is forcing us to look at how society must be changed in ways that offer the prospect of a more humane and satisfying life to everybody, less obsessed with material possessions, more concerned about relationships and the quality of how we interact with each other, and trying to take money out of that equation more and more, because money is the nexus through which we interact with most of us. We need to decommodify land, labor, and money, as Polanyi put it so strongly. Less focused on what I want and more focused on what the biosystem and society needs from all of us, and more nourished and fulfilled by the beauty of the world around me than by endless videos on my phone. In other words, we need very fundamentally to get back, each of us in our own personal way, to examining our values and examining very fundamental aspects of how we relate to ourselves and to the planet around us. That's a transition. And to do that for everybody requires that it be just, which means far more sweeping changes for those of us who are the privileged elite that live in this so-called developed part of the world, and to give the space to the people in the rest of the world who have very low carbon footprints and ecological footprints to be able themselves to flourish in a new way. We have so much to learn from them, and we need very desperately to learn that and to put it into effect. So, Garmila Mahmoud.
Thank you, Pader. For people that are arriving late, this is the Just a Just Transition an event that follows on from the report that we've just published with ARC, Rural Ireland on the Move, and we'll keep sharing that in the chat. So we're hearing some insights from some of the people that contributed to that report. Thanks, Padder, and we're going to move now to Caroline White on a similar theme, but Caroline her piece was around the role of the well-being economy in a just transition. So Caroline is on the steering group and a member of the new Wellbeing Economy Alliance Hub for Ireland. It's an all-Ireland hub, and is an active member of FASTA, the Sustainable Economics Foundation. And Caroline, you're going to give us an 8-minute sort of overview. Thanks, Caroline.
Thanks very much. I'm delighted to be at this event. Thank you for inviting me. So my name's Caroline White, as Davey mentioned, and I work for FASTA, which is the Foundation for the Economics of Sustainability. And FASTA, our focus in FASTA is based on ecological economics. So the idea is that we're very interested in, very similar to the kinds of things that Padder was talking about. We're very interested in reorienting the economy as a whole, away from growth as a goal, away from expansion of material production, and towards well-being. So again, as Padder was saying, it's very important to have a vision or an idea of where we want the economy to go, and that's a real focus for us. Not just what's wrong, but also where we want to go, where we want to head. What's our vision? You know, what do we want to happen in the economy in the future? So an important aspect of ecological economics is that for us, the economy is embedded within the environment and it's completely and utterly dependent on the environment, and that needs to be reflected in the way that it's run. And so, you know, when we're talking about things like place-based transition, just transition, and so on, if we want to make changes on the ground, you know, localized changes, which are absolutely vital, we also need to look at the overall picture, the systemic picture, the kinds of forces that are encouraging people to act in certain ways. As Padder mentioned again, the sorts of, you know, the top-down EU, for example, level policy directions and so on. And we need to be questioning those because those are kind of basic parameters that really affect the dynamics of the overall economy. And so for us, for example, if you're talking about the economy being dependent on the environment, you can't rely solely on price to make sure that you're going to get the economy to fit within ecological limits. And the reason for that is because of, as has been mentioned, the extremely profligate use of resources by the wealthy, and the fact that even if you've got high prices on resources, you're still not going to be able to prevent very wealthy people, so money is no object, basically, from just burning through things, literally frying things up, you know. So there has to be a strong emphasis on regulation. Price can have a role and it can be useful, but we know. If we price things right, we'll be fine. And we're saying, no, we need regulations as well. We need to have a very strong framework of regulations. And we would fit that, again, also into the idea of the donut economy, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, which is, again, an ecological economics idea, where you've got strong environmental limits observed. Then within those limits, the challenge then is what do you do to the economy to make sure that it can survive and it can function well? Everybody gets what they need. We have a just transition with the emphasis on just as well as transition. And so that's a very, very interesting subject. And I've been working on a paper which kind of focuses on, particularly on agriculture and the sorts of broad economic measures that could be carried out that are cross-sectoral, not only in agriculture, but elsewhere as well, and which could potentially help to ease pressure on the economy to expand and grow, make it easier for people to change their lifestyles, to have less consumption-oriented lifestyles, and to focus on other values. And COVID has shown that, you know, we all have other values. We're not all just interested in consumption and working and production. You know, we all have other values. And so this paper that I'm working on, we're going to have a little launch for it on April 28th, just a quick plug for that if anyone's interested. And we have a group of panelists who are going to react to it. And so basically I'm talking about 5 measures that could be introduced in the broader economy in Ireland that could help to ease this pressure to expand on the economy and help at the consumer level. So, you know, helping farmers to adapt, also helping people in rural economies to adapt, helping to encourage people to come and live in the rural economy, because we're going to need that. The future economy in agriculture is going to be more labour intensive, very likely, or to put it in a better way, more job rich. There'll be more people working in agriculture, and if it's good quality work, that would be brilliant. So that's vital. So we need to encourage those sorts of dynamics. We need to encourage changes at the consumer end as well, as has been said already by Michelle. So all of these kinds of broader dynamics it's good to look at measures that could help with that. So basically, I'm looking at 5 different things that I think could help, and I'm looking forward to having a discussion about all of that. How am I doing for time? Okay, so I'll just quickly talk about them then. So the 5 particular things that I'm going to be talking about are a universal basic income that would go to every resident of Ireland, which is quite different from the kind of cap-based direct payments that go only to farmers, which sometimes people confuse the two. So I'm just making sure I'm talking about a different thing here. It's something that would be an equal allocation of money to everybody in Ireland. And complementary to that, you need to also have a strengthened social wage, which means universal basic services. So that means better healthcare and, crucially for Ireland, better housing, because that's a huge problem in Ireland. And it's a kind of a break to a lot of things. I think it's a break, strangely enough, indirect though it might sound, it's a break to the just transition, because a lot of people, they have big mortgages to pay, they have big rents to pay. They can't be focusing on climate. They can't be focusing on the environment. They have too many stresses, too many other things going on. So if we find ways to relieve those stresses, that can really help, I think, to reorient values and reorient what people are doing. So that's, housing is a big one. And interestingly enough, there's a huge potential in Ireland because we have a lot of vacant housing in small rural villages and towns, and there's a potential for funding to be used. There's already some funding, but for that to be expanded, to draw on European funding as well, to use potentially just transition funding perhaps, to help to provide social housing that would make use of some of these rural properties. And then also there's various other things. Taxation policy can be changed to make it easier for farmers to hire people if they need help, because there's a lot of overwork in the agricultural sector. And then maybe a really crucial one for me is the whole issue of debt, and looking at debt and thinking about reconstructing debt and working on different ways of structuring debt or changing it for equity in ways that encourage agroecology, and just relieving, if you like, there's a danger of stranded assets in certain sectors of agriculture where there's been a lot of infrastructure investment and a lot of debt generated. So there needs to be a way to really address that, look at it in the face and deal with that. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Caroline. So that was setting the frame now. We're going to go a bit deeper with Ollie Moore. If you've just arrived, we're sort of launching and building on the new report. I've just shared the link in the chat, Rural Ireland on the Move, Farm Diversification and Just Transition. We're hearing now from some of the speakers, or some of the contributors, sorry, to that report. And Oliver Moore, one of the editors of the report. Ollie is the communications director and editor-in-chief at ARC 2020, which is a European think tank communications on rural issues and agricultural issues. He's also a lecturer at the Centre for Corporate Studies in UCC, a resident Cloughjordan Ecovillage, active on the farm and with Cultivate. So Ollie's going to look at new threats to just transition. Ollie.
Hi everybody. So I'll be flying through the slides, so when you see my hand go, you go as well, because they're kind of specific type of slides I'm doing. So yeah, hi everybody. So I'm going to talk about the new threats to a just transition, specifically in the agri-food sphere. So it's not, so it's quite specific, and most of it's in the report as well anyway, but I'm honing in on a couple of areas. Just to maybe frame it as well, we heard from Michelle about the climate targets that we're missing. So agri-food has to hit between 21 and 30% of a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, and land use change and forestry has to reach up to 58% of reduction by 2030. So those targets are strong by global standards, and we're not on target for those. Similarly, we have water and biodiversity targets that we're not hitting. We've lost nearly all of our pristine rivers, and there's an increasing number of birds on the red list, just as an example. So we're trying to fix that kind of stuff, and it's difficult to do anyway, but there are some specific things that make it more difficult. So that's what my presentation is about, basically. So we'll go on to the first problem, is disaster capitalism. So never miss the opportunity a good crisis offers is kind of what disaster capitalism is about. So unfortunately, in 2008, there was an economic crisis, and that meant that we didn't get around to fixing environmental issues because it was too difficult. Then there was Brexit, then there's fodder crisis in agriculture, there's climate catastrophes that happen on the ground, there's COVID. So there has always been a reason not to do the right thing. This is a problem. And it's not just that there's a genuine problem, it's that the forces of business as usual capitalize on the problem and double down on the thing that's actually causing the problem in the first place, typically. The most recent one then is the war in Ukraine. So what's happening in agri-food in relation to the war on the Ukraine? Obviously, most importantly, thousands of people are dead and injured. Move on to Oscar, sorry. Millions have been displaced in Europe. You know, within 6 weeks, there's 10 million people displaced, which is, you know, seismic, really. It's getting towards the levels of the displacements that happened after World War II. Crops and fertilizers are underproduced or unavailable. There's a lot to be said on that, but just to be specific, I suppose it's about, you know, fertilizers and crops for animal feed and so on. But business as usual is capitalizing on this. So if you can see here, this is a tweet from the biggest group in the European Parliament, the European People's Party, which is the group Fine Gael is in. And they're basically saying, well, now that there's a food security crisis, we must immediately postpone anything to do with farm to fork and biodiversity strategies that may have a negative impact on our food safety. So the issue is, though, is it a food safety security crisis, or is it an animal feed and mineral fertilizer exposure situation that we're in? So this is kind of, you know, we use huge amounts of land and resources to grow crops to fuel cars or to feed animals. So, you know, we're very self-sufficient actually in Europe on cereal crops for human consumption. So there's this kind of problem that we're, you know, creating the illusion of a food security crisis when in fact we have a food system that's heavily resource dependent and very exposed. You can see here, for example, where our food tends to go, where our crops tend to go, and, you know, industrial uses and animal feeds are the vast majority of it in the richest parts of the world. In the poorest parts of the world, unsurprisingly, people grow crops to eat because that's what you do. But we have just a very intense food system that produces you know, crops for other purposes because we have the land for that, apparently. And yet, at the same time, organic ostensibly takes up too much space. It's ridiculous. So we have a heavily exposed and dependent agri-food system. We grow crops to feed animals and cars, and we will wean off this dependency sometime soon, apparently. But that's what Farm to Fork is about. So the biggest group in the European Parliament are trying to argue that we need to postpone the Farm to Fork, and yet Farm to Fork is about doing things like reducing fertilizer dependency. You know, just bringing it down a certain amount. We would be less exposed, if we had done this earlier, we'd be less exposed now to being implicated in war, because fertilizers are made with, you know, natural gas that has to reach 550 degrees centigrade. So natural gas is what makes fertilizer. We should be less dependent on fertilizer. And Farm to Fork is about that. And yet the biggest group in the European Parliament wants us to get rid of the process that will reduce our dependency on fertilizer. So next slide. And what's happening is that actually lots of these things are being delayed or postponed. The nature restoration regulation has been postponed, the pesticide regulation has been postponed, and the rules on fallow land are being changed to allow us to grow crops, because apparently there's a shortage of crops. There's a shortage of animal feed crops because we've left ourselves completely exposed. And the impact of this on the environment across Europe will be huge, and it's not being assessed at all. We constantly hear about how farm to fork has to go through an impact assessment. This decision was made with no impact assessment whatsoever. There's a link here, which is also in the report, to a thread by an academic, Guy Pierre, who goes through what some of the implications might be of this change in fallow land for the environment. And it's astronomical. And it's completely unassessed. It's amazing what gets not to be assessed when it's a supposed emergency, when, you know, all we ever hear about with farm to fork is that it needs to be better assessed, like. So move on there. And meanwhile, there's emergency bailout money continuously being given to an agri-food system that's completely exposed. I'm not saying that the individual moment is wrong, because the system is dependent, the animals have to be fed, but we keep doing this. We had a bailout in February for the pig meat sector, and now we have another one in April. Like, we keep doing this. We need to, and what's happening is that the meat is being stored in freezers because there's no market for it. So, like, this is a ridiculous situation, because the freezers are obviously being powered by fossil fuels as well. Another threat to the, so that's one threat. I'll run through this quickly because I've got 2 minutes left. The Just Transition process has not engaged communities properly. Lawrence is going to talk about that later, so I don't have to talk about that in more detail now. So listen to Lawrence for that later on. The cap we're about to agree is crap, and this is a problem, obviously. We're about to agree a cap that will embed business as usual until 2027. There are some good elements, I'm not going to deny that. The cooperation projects is really good and is progressive. The rules on eligible acres are an improvement on what could have been agreed at the European level. There's some minimal redistribution of cash, but it's the smallest amount over the longest time frame technically allowable. However, there are no climate targets. It's unambitious in terms of eco schemes, and it's unambitious by design. It's designed not to be ambitious, which goes against the cap that was agreed. It's like the cap itself that was agreed in December says that eco schemes have to, by law, be ambitious. It's stipulated, and stipulated is the word that the Commission used in its letter to Ireland, that the eco schemes have to be ambitious, but they're unambitious by design to get people in. So that's obviously not going to work for a transition, and it doesn't even meet its own environmental assessments, the Ireland's CAP plan. This is what the European Commission said to Ireland in a letter we leaked on the ARC website last week. The Commission has doubts about the effective contribution of the CAP strategic plan to the general CAP objective on environmental protection, one of the 3 overarching CAP objectives. It is in this context that, and this is a quote from the Commission, further improvements and more ambition are required for the Commission to approve the CAP strategic plan. So the Commission doesn't say a word like required without meaning it. So stipulated and required, so stipulated and required are 2 words they've used about the Irish CAP plan. So these changes have to be made. The Commission, and they specifically signal the massive growth in the dairy herd as being a problem, making it very difficult for Ireland to reach its targets. So this is a direct quote from them as well. The Commission has doubts about whether what is proposed goes far enough. In this context, it particularly has in mind the substantial growth in the size of the Irish dairy herd in recent years, a growth which has had very substantial implications for agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, for quality of air, water and soil, and for biodiversity. So that's the Commission talking to Ireland. That's not the environmental pillar, that's not on Tashka, that's not Friends of the Earth, that's the Commission, the European Commission, telling us that our CAP plan is not fit for purpose. So this is, and what are we doing about it? Well, we're increasing the number of the stocking rate and the fertilizer use on a small number of farms that keeps increasing all the time by allowing the nitrates rules to be avoided through the nitrates directive derogation. So you can see how we keep increasing the stocking rate on 6,000 farms basically, which makes it even more difficult for us to reach our targets. So this is Charlie McGonagall on St. Patrick's Day, the Agriculture Minister, announcing proudly that, yes, we have another exemption. There's only 4 countries left in Europe using this exemption now, and Ireland is the only one, as far as I'm aware, that's increasing its use of this exemption. So how are we going to reach our targets if we keep allowing a small number of dairy farmers to overstock the land. I know they have to do more environmental practices, bigger buffer strips and so on, to prevent pollution going into the water and so on. But from a basic, even environmental climate targets perspective, it's obvious that our absolute emissions will not come down if we keep using this. And are we going to keep using this in 2025, 2027 and so on? So yeah, so Fintan Kelly will talk about these kind of issues as well later. So I'm coming to the end now. So apart from disaster capitalism, a non-inclusive just transition process, a crap cap and productivist expansion, especially in dairy, without due care given to the negative socio-environmental impacts, were grand. So that's my thing.
Thanks, Ollie. If you've just arrived, this is just a Just Transition, an event by Sustainable Projects Ireland supported by the IN, and it's blended. So we have 26 participants online and about 10, 12 people in the room. You're all very welcome. We're building on top of the report just released this week, which is all about the just transition and diversification. And we're doing a second event this afternoon from this digital studio in the WeCreate building in Cloughjordan Ecovillage. So we're going to keep moving and we're going to stay on the theme of agriculture. I'm going to ask Fintan if you could go next, Fintan, because Bridget from Teleview has just arrived physically into the studio. So let's give her a few minutes. So Fintan, if you're okay, Fintan's the Agricultural and Land Use Policy Officer at the Irish Environmental Network, and Fintan's contribution was to the report, and which she'll introduce now, was intensive ag must pull its weight in a just transition. So Fintan.
Thanks, Davy. So as Davy said, I'm going to be talking about intensive farms must pull their weight for a just transition. And I think it's some of the points I'll raise are relevant to the basically all the other speakers, and particularly I think Patter's point on ensuring that climate action doesn't exacerbate existing inequalities in agriculture or Irish society. So in response to the global climate crisis and Ireland's associated commitments under the Paris Agreement, the government have committed in law to transitioning to a climate neutral economy by 2050, with an immediate target of halving emissions by 2030. This target represents a significant but necessary challenge to all sectors of society. Strong, rapid and sustained reductions in emissions will necessitate unprecedented changes with far-reaching consequences for affected communities and the environment. The failure to act over preceding decades mean that significant change must now happen over a narrow window of opportunity. There is a risk that the transition to a climate neutral society may neither be sustainable or just unless environmental and socioeconomic sustainability are rapidly hardwired into relevant policies. Conversely, if the principles of a just transition and environmentalism can be integrated into climate policies, then this significant policy driver could be harnessed to deliver a fairer and greener society. Next slide, please. Nor are these considerations more important than in the agriculture and land use sectors. In Ireland, agriculture accounts for a third of total greenhouse gas emissions. 85% of Ireland's agricultural emissions are associated directly or indirectly with cattle. Given the large proportion of emissions emanating from the sector, it is clear that emissions reductions will be needed, and therefore the sector has been tasked with cutting emissions by 21 to 30% by 2030. To support this target, the Climate Change Advisory Council have published sectoral carbon budgets and scenarios based on a range of emissions reduction scenarios. Given the link between the number of cattle nationally and the total greenhouse gas emissions, the Advisory Council recommends that an absolute reduction in the number of cattle will be needed. Under their carbon budget scenarios, where agricultural emissions are required to reduce by 30% or more, suckler cow inventories decline to 200,000 by 2030. There is a larger spread in the magnitude of the reduction required in the dairy cow numbers, and these reductions are set within the context of the ongoing increase in the national dairy herd since the abolition of milk quotas. One obvious observation across these scenarios is that the onus is being placed on the suckler herd to reduce significantly to facilitate the dairy sector. This is the result of the Advisory Council's interpretation of the legislation, which requires that the carbon budgets take into account, insofar as is practical, the need to maximize employment, the attractiveness to the state for investment, and long-term competitiveness of the economy. The focus on economic output and job creation has biased the scenarios in favour of dairy production. The Advisory Council has interpreted the need to maximise employment and state investment at an aggregated national level. However, intensive dairy production is concentrated in the regions of the country with the most productive land, with the dairy processing sector mirroring that distribution. This bias in favour of overly simplistic economic indicators fundamentally undermines the scenarios, which fail to consider the need to ensure equity in opportunities and burden sharing across society, considering disproportionate regional impacts. Next slide, please. This prioritisation of the dairy sector also has a domino effect on national land use policy, as the Advisory Council have identified that emissions from the ag sector will also need to be offset within the land use sector. This isn't straightforward, however, as the land use sector is projected to be a net source of emissions of 7.1 million tonnes CO2 equivalent by 2030. In order to achieve the desired emissions reductions in the land use sector, dramatic changes in land use are recommended, such as the rewetting of over 100,000 or 110,000 hectares of drained organic soils, and the moving from a current annual afforestation rate of 2,500 hectares per annum to 20,000 hectares per annum in 2028. Based on existing government policies, these targets seem unrealistic, and given Ireland's track record when it comes to environmental sustainability and public participation in the peat and forestry sectors, it is unlikely that the targets could be achieved sustainably without significant changes to relevant policies. Either way, it is clear that rewetting and afforestation are actions that will not be proposed in the dairy heartlands, again placing the responsibility for action on farmers on marginally productive land. From a just transition perspective, while the economic opportunities presented by the dairy sector are concentrated in the wealthiest parts of the country, the burden of offsetting the resulting greenhouse gas emissions through herd reductions and land use change falls on farmers who have been historically marginalised by a range of factors, such as the physical constraints of the land or socioeconomic isolation. We believe that the scenarios produced by the Advisory Council do not reflect the complex, multifaceted legal or policy framework that underpins our modern democracy and our aspirations for a fair and sustainable rural economy. It is our view that a just transition requires policies that ensure that there is equity and equality in responsibility and opportunities presented by the agri-food sector and climate action. The scale of the changes proposed by the targets set for herd reduction and land use change will have wide-ranging implications for affected communities. The Advisory Council has given some recognition to these concerns, but they raise the need for government policy to mitigate negative impacts, rather than ensuring that positive outcomes across all regions are prioritised in tailored scenarios. We would like to see scenarios that maximise environmental benefits of sustainable farming practices and environmentally beneficial land use and habitat management. By judging the value of a farm to society based only on economic output alone, we risk exacerbating the decline in high nature value farms, which deliver a range of public goods and services such as biodiversity, carbon sequestration, flood attenuation, and cultural and recreational landscapes. Reducing agricultural emissions by destocking intensive farms or environmental indicators such as water quality and air pollution indicate that the intensity of farming has exceeded the environment's carrying capacity would deliver multiple environmental benefits. Ignoring the climate impact of intensive farms won't wish away the known biodiversity and water and air quality issues. Moving forward, we need a more holistic vision for the future of Irish agriculture and land use that recognises the multitude of environmental and cultural goods and services provided by some farmers and the unsustainability of current market-driven policies. We need to ensure a just and a sustainable transition for farming in response to our climate and biodiversity crises. Ultimately, intensive farms must pull their weight to ensure a just transition. Thank you.
Thanks, Fintan. That was great. So we're going to continue now on the farming theme and the need for transition away from fossil fuels in farming. And we have Bridget Murphy from Tallaght Bio. So Bridget is a farmer and she's the project manager of Tallaght Bio's soil biodiversity literacy and enhancement EIP that they're currently working on. Bridget is also instrumental in Tallaght Bio's campaign for women in agriculture and contributed to the new report. So over to you, Bridget.
Thank you, Davy. And again, from Tallaght Bio, and following on then from what Fintan was talking about the industrial sector, we would be the agri-ecological farming organization. It's really important when you look at conventional agriculture to realize that it's no mistake to call it fossil fuel agriculture. If you have a look at, Ali spoke already about the amount of natural gas that's needed for fertilizer, but if you look at the fossil fuels that are needed for the pesticides, for the herbicides, for the fuel for the vehicles that are going in, absolutely everything that we understand about modern agriculture or conventional agriculture is underpinned by the fossil fuel industry. So when we start talking about the transition without even looking at the word just in it, we realize that the current policy, and as Ollie was talking about again, policies ranging from CAP, that policy is designed and led and implemented by the exact stakeholders that are these fossil fuel kind of stakeholders. And still you'll always hear me saying we need to get that agro-ecological voice to that stakeholder table. But it kind of shows this idea, that Einstein used to talk about, you can't solve a problem using the thinking that created the problem. And in some senses, that's exactly what we're doing when we're talking about the transition in agriculture. The exact people that have caused a huge amount of the problem and the damage are the ones that are landscaping the solutions. So if we're having a look at how we are going to transition, in practice, groups like, the agroecological kind of farmers, we aren't waiting for the policy to come. We're starting from the ground up, literally from the soil. And following another sort of really amazing person, one of my favorite quotes, Buckminster Fuller, that if you can't change something from the inside, if you want to kind of change an existing paradigm, the best way to do it is just to make it obsolete. And so if we're having a look at that kind of idea of just going ahead and getting going with transforming things from the ground up, along the agroecological kind of principles, which are based on, say, for example, diversity. So you'll see the soil biodiversity, the indigenous knowledge, or the knowledge of the farmer, peer-to-peer, farmers working together on this, leading by example. Talifbio is doing all of this in this EIP. So a description of the EIP, the long verse, as Davy said, is the soil enhancement, literacy and enhancement. So we're learning. There's a very, very strong educational component to this. And we're actually just waiting for all of our microscopes to be arriving. We're doing a full sort of 63-hour course on the soil food web, and I'll discuss a little bit about that now, and then an 8-hour microscopy course. So we are able to go out and actually analyze our soils and see what the diversity of life inside it is. Soil carbon is basically your soil fertility. And it's a very old sound bite by now, that 20 to 70% of soil carbon is gone in soils across the world, and that we have about 60 years left of harvestable kind of like soils. So it's really, really critical to start building that soil carbon. So as I say, we're learning that carbon feeds the soil and the soil food web, and they in turn feed the plants, allowing them to produce yields of nutrient-dense food that are appropriate to our individual ecosystems, climates, and cultures. The soil food web refers to the multitude of life in the soil. So this life ranges from microscopic one-cell bacteria, algae, fungi, protozoa, to your larger nematodes, arthropods, earthworms, insects, plant roots, and small animals. And these life forms not only break down organic matter and aerate the soil and prey on unwanted pests and make nutrients available to the plant, they also kind of die and become another source of carbon in the soil. So once again, this is the soundbite of in 1 teaspoon of soil alone, you could be looking at over 600 million bacterial cells. Chemical fertilizers and pesticides, however, all the stuff that comes from that fossil fuel industry, adversely affect many of these beneficial life forms in the soil, killing them or causing them to migrate or go dormant. So your chemical fertilizers are also highly soluble in water. They leach into the groundwater before the plant has actually been able to use them. They seep into the subsoil where they interact with clay, forming impermeable layers of compacted layers of soil. With your compacted soil, and in the absence of certain soil bacteria which breaks down organic matter into the plant nutrients and helping to convert nitrogen from the air, your soil health becomes negatively affected. Plants become addicted to the chemical fertilizer as they're unable to get their nutrients from the soil via the soil food web. Your soil bacteria also regulate diseases. Those get lost, and so too is the function of keeping your bugs and your grubs and your other parasites in check. So plants growing in these unhealthy soils are then attacked by disease and pests and parasites, and the solution then is to apply more fertilizer and more pesticides, furthering this deadly kind of spiral. So as some of the speakers have mentioned, with the current focus on the war in the Ukraine and the shortage and the high cost of chemical fertilizers, now would be the right time to transition away from these chemical fertilizers and transition towards regenerating your soil and breaking that addiction. Despite industry claims to the contrary, agroecological systems that don't use chemical fertilizers are incredibly resilient and productive, but there is a small transition time as you wean off the addiction. However, as Ollie mentioned, instead of moving in this direction, the industrial agricultural system has just responded by ensuring supports are available to assist farmers with the increased input costs of the imported grain for feedstock and chemical fertilizers, essentially doubling down on that damage to the soil, ironically, in the name of transition and food security. There's just a couple of other points I'd like to add. That it talks about how we are looking at the soil, allowing us to transition away from the chemical fertilizers. But I just wanted to pick up something that Peter kind of spoke about in the beginning, which is when we're talking about just and we're wanting to leave nobody behind, I think we have to acknowledge that we've already left a massive section of farmers behind already. And when we talk about transition now, we're wanting to kind of help the industrial system make the transition, when it's actually the farmers on the ground that have already been left behind that critically need that intervention to bring them up to speed to allow them to start regenerating the soils. So, I mean, I think it's important once again to keep pointing out the fact that our problems hide in plain sight right in front of us. But the best thing that we can do to really start getting this transition moving is to start acting on the ground and to start showing these results and allow the policy to catch up with farmers' practice. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Bridget. That was really insightful. We're going to go beyond farming now, as the report doesn't just look at agriculture in the just transition and the diversification. So we have Olive McCarthy now, who's going to give us an insight from her contribution to the report beyond farming, a transition to energy efficiency to low carbon households. Dr. Olive McCarthy is a senior lecturer with the Department of Food Business and Development and director for the Centre for Corporate Studies, both at the University of Cork. You're very welcome, Olive.
Great, thank you, Davy, and good morning, everyone. So I suppose really now for something completely different in a way, but of course linked to the general themes here this morning. And this is a report on a piece of research that I have conducted and just
Olive, maybe turn your camera off. Yeah. We can't, we're not picking you up.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better.
Yeah, okay, thanks very much. Sorry about that. I don't see my slides up there now at the moment, but are they up there? Yeah, okay, great. Thank you very much. The context of this research really was in terms of low-income households, and particularly households with low disposable income. And it's research that was carried out last year in association with the Money Advice and Budgeting Service, and targeting clients of that particular service in terms of looking at energy efficiency and improving, I suppose, energy efficiency in the household and thereby reducing energy costs. And the context of that research, as we all know, it was in the whole space of the increasing energy costs increasing carbon taxes, which tend to very much impact those on low income in particular because of the type of fuel that they would use in the household, for example. Just in terms of the climate action plan, I mean, the potentially regressive effects of carbon taxes is recognised in the climate action plan, and there is an emphasis on the need for a just transition, and that was analysed very well by Pader there earlier on this morning. There are measures in place to help offset the impact of carbon taxes, particularly for those on low income or low disposable income in this particular case. So when we're talking about MAB's clients, it's not necessarily all of them are in low income, some just have low disposable income due to high mortgage repayments, for example. So some measures that exist already and that are kind of very much put out there as what's appropriate for people on low disposable income would be free energy upgrades, which I'll talk about shortly, low cost loans. So we hear a lot about green loans, for example, and low cost loans that are targeted very much at those who are low income. And this is part of the government policy to try and support those on low income. The free energy upgrades that are currently available include things like attic insulation. You can see a list there: cavity wall insulation, external wall insulation, draft proofing, energy efficient lighting, and those free upgrades are available to people in receipt of certain social welfare allowances at the moment. So for example, those on the fuel allowance, those on job seekers allowance for over 6 months, one parent family payment, domiciliary care allowance, which I could point out is not necessarily targeted at those on low income, carers allowance, and just more recently we have seen the government announcement where the scheme has been expanded to include those on disability allowance for 6 months or more, and I think with a child under the age of 7. So they're quite specific kind of people who qualify for that. So they're the free upgrades available to those on certain social welfare payments. For everyone else, there's grant aided retrofitting or kind of energy efficiency measures for the household. Anywhere between 50 to 80% of those, the cost of that is grant aided, and as mentioned already, then green loans for those who need to borrow to pay for retrofitting, coming in at around 6 to 8% APR. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So in terms of low disposable income households, as we said, or low income households, there are a number of problems. Not everyone qualifies for free upgrades. So just as I said, because you've low disposable income doesn't mean you actually are in receipt of social welfare payments. It could be for very high household costs, for example. And we also see in research all around the world that even those who do qualify, they often don't engage with the system because either they don't have enough information, they're afraid to engage, and they have competing priorities. And if we think about kind of current clients with the money advice and budgeting services, these are people who are in crisis debt, and their priority really is about trying to get out of crisis debt. They're not really thinking about energy efficiency in the household, even though energy efficiency will help to reduce costs in the household. So there's a lot going on for people in this situation. The other problems then around grant aid. So if somebody who doesn't qualify for free upgrades, obviously the grant aid is there, but often the money required for those kind of grant aided projects is required up front. And people on low disposable income don't have that kind of money. And then green loans are not suitable for those who are already over indebted, who cannot access credit, for example, because they're already over indebted, or who don't want to take on more debt. So we have a real problem here for those with low disposable income. So we'll go next slide, please. So the research that we did, a very small scale project, as I said, we focused on an urban area. And I just want to point out, obviously we're talking a lot about kind of rural communities this morning. And so we feel that the results of our research, in an urban area where there's access to every kind of energy supply, this is probably best case scenario. And so for rural areas, these kinds of issues are probably much more acute, and we'd like to do some more research that focuses more on rural areas to see just how acute those issues are. Very maybe old housing, without access to many energy supply, for example. So this project, as I said, is very small scale, funded by the IRC, the Irish Research Council New Foundations Programme. We surveyed all of the clients in North Dublin MABs, about 800 to 1,000 people. We received 128 responses, which is actually quite good considering that these are people who are already kind of in crisis and who are willing to give their time and get involved in this research. We also did a number of interviews, which I'll talk about later, but these were to kind of interviews with people who'd already engaged in some kind of initiative in the household to use as kind of peer case studies for others in similar situation to see kind of what changes they could make. So next slide, please. And I'm just going to race through this. I know a very short time. As you can see there, 64% of respondents had a mortgage or owned their home. So again, this is people on low disposable income, not necessarily low income. 59% were in receipt of social welfare. So again, it wasn't everybody in the sample. And again, you can see only 15% were in receipt of job seekers allowance. So we're not talking about people who, in long-term unemployment either. 60% said that they checked their energy bills, they paid by direct debit or cash, but 25% use prepay meters, and prepay meters are much more convenient but a much more expensive way to pay for energy. So that just gives you kind of a general profile of the respondents. Next, please. What's really interesting is that people in the household were very much engaged in energy efficiency practices already. So these kind of habitual activities, turning off unnecessary lights, boiling as much water as they needed, unplugging electronics. Only 35% were aware of home retrofit grants, which is interesting, and 59% qualified for free upgrades, but only 9% had availed of any upgrades. So while there was, lots of people had qualified for this, many didn't actually avail of it. So that tells you again that there's issues here in terms of why people wouldn't engage in free upgrades. Next, please. Some of the barriers there that they said, half of the survey respondents said they would not probably invest in home retrofit, and cost obviously was a huge issue for 90% of respondents. But again, information was really important, understanding the benefits, knowing that it would improve the health and well-being of the household, were all kind of factors. And there's some quotes there on the right hand side where people have said, I cannot afford to do upgrades. If you cannot afford the co-payment, then you have to have money up front, and I don't have that kind of money. I want to be energy efficient, but I can't afford to be. And then there was one person who had work done, paid for it themselves, and now they were in difficulty with that money, which is why they had gone to MABS in the first place. So it's just kind of interesting to see the cost of this is a huge barrier for people. Next, please. The supports needed then, again, it was really interesting that there was a huge willingness for people to engage. They really wanted to reduce the carbon emissions of the household and increase the energy efficiency of the household, but they needed more grant aid. Particularly what emerged was a need for more advice and information on how to actually do this and what the benefits of it were. And you can see that people there just needed support, one-on-one support to engage. So they wanted information but not forms. They wanted help with the forms, and really understanding, climate change would be a huge incentive for people as well. So interesting to see that kind of level of a willingness to engage. Next, please. So in conclusion then, so what we can conclude from this is that financial incentives alone, or even free retrofitting, which is very much pushed in current government policy, is not enough and will not be enough to support these kinds of households to engage in kind of retrofitting and improving energy efficiency. And we do need a wider range of tailored measures to reach those households with low disposable income. And what we felt was, what was really needed is more information. This idea of one-to-one advice is really critical in terms of supporting people, helping with form filling, understanding what it is, the changes that they can make in their household that are supported externally. Because we know they're doing an awful lot internally in the household to try and reduce their energy bills. Also, the broadening of the qualifying criteria for free retrofitting is needed. It was interesting, on foot of this research, the SCAI did reach out to us to talk about some of this, and the recent announcement does extend the criteria, as we said, to those on disability allowance, but to my mind really just doesn't go far enough in terms of extending the criteria to qualify for free upgrades. But free upgrades on their own isn't enough. There really is the need for much more information made available. And I see someone has just mentioned something in the comments there about this, and there's lots of other countries that are doing much more than we are. I think Italy has a completely free energy upgrade system as well. So this idea of one-on-one advice and outreach into communities is going to be really, really important to support this. And the St. Vincent de Paul have suggested that we would have community energy advisors, so people in local communities who would maybe be well known in that community, who can advise their peers essentially, and bring people along with them in this kind of transition. So as I said, while we are talking about the rural context this morning, this I think is the best case scenario that we have in terms of the research. And I think if we were to do more research in this space in the rural area, we'd see that these kinds of issues are much more acute and need to be addressed very quickly and with a much broader range of qualifying criteria. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Olive. That was really helpful to see some of the incentives and also the barriers as we move into just transition, especially beyond agriculture. So we've got one more little input here, which isn't in the report. So if you came in late, we are launching today this report, Rural Ireland on the Move. We're this morning with the Sustainable Projects Ireland, the Ecovillage project, looking at just transition. This afternoon, we're looking at diversification. We cultivate. Both of these are supported by the IEN. And the report was done by ARC and the Cooperative Studies Centre in UCC with researchers here. But we never we didn't have this piece, which I think is really useful. And Lawrence Fulham is came today to give us a bit of an insight in what's been left out of the Just Transition process so far in the Midlands and what local communities can offer. So Lawrence, you're very welcome. Lawrence is a founding member of Creative Rathangan Mehel, and he has a background in adult and community education and is a very keen interest in history. So Lawrence, if you want to come in.
Okay. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon at this stage. I felt initially that I was the odd fish at this particular event, but I hear similar issues coming up across all of the presentations. So one of the things that's very striking if you're living around the Midlands is that everybody is talking about just transition, but it's become a phrase that is almost meaningless. And if you were to look up somebody like W.C. Fields, the comedian, he would use the term a euphonious compendium. It sounds wonderful and contains a lot, but what does it actually mean? Interestingly enough, I found myself in recent weeks trying to locate the national definition of just transition, and I couldn't find one. All I could find was the policy framework set out in the Climate Action Plan, which Cather Kirby referenced earlier. And looking at that, you'll see things like integrated and evidence-based approaches. Well, our just transition process in the Midlands has not been particularly integrated, and I'm not so sure about being evidence-based either, and I'll come back to this. People are equipped with the right skills. And here, there's an assumption that the people who are on the receiving end of just transition need skills. I would argue that many of the people in agencies, whether it be leader, whether it be county development boards, etc., do not have the skills or even the mindset to properly deliver on just transition. I've seen very little evidence that existing inequalities are not exacerbated, and social dialogue so far has been absent more often than present. So if I can go back a bit to talk about the group, Creative Rathangan Mehel was established in 2016, largely because we saw the opportunities there in the Creative Ireland Fund to fund some work that we were interested in doing without too many complications. And what we were interested in doing was asking questions around what happens when Bord na Móna ends its peat extraction, and how can we involve local people in a conversation that goes beyond saying no, or not for me, or what's in it for you. And we had built up quite a good relationship with Bord na Móna, and in particular its ecology team. And I suppose in retrospect, that relationship was built on personal contact, not on a commitment from the organization. We also pulled in people from the history departments and geography departments of Maynooth, and that gave our seminars and events a particular standing, though I think very often we knew more about the subject than the academics. We linked up with the Irish Peatlands Conservation Council and more recently with the Community Wetlands Forum. And all the time we were just trying to get people talking about what was possible and looking at how we might collaborate. But the end of peat extraction came far sooner than we'd anticipated, and with it came COVID. And virtually everything in terms of face-to-face contact came to an abrupt end. And looking back on the last 2 years or so, I suspect that COVID proved useful to those who were delivering the particular form of just transition that we've experienced in the Midlands, in that they didn't have to find too many reasons for their lack of engagement with communities. So a point I'd make is that just transition is only the latest part of a phase move away from the industrial extraction of peat by Bord na Móna. In fact, the process began in the 1990s with the closure of ESB generation stations in Port Tarlington and Allen Wood, and Rathangan sits between those two power stations, and the closure of a briquette factory in Lullymore. Bord na Móna simply paid off its workers. They were made redundant. The ESB, on the other hand, put a development worker into Allen Wood, and that led to the establishment of a community-run enterprise centre, which is still there and thriving. It's only since 2015 or thereabouts that we began to hear the word just transition in the Midlands. And it was being pushed very strongly by SIP2 and IC2. The language entered the political discourse, but there's no sense of it being owned, there being a common understanding of what just transition means. More often than not, it's a soundbite. We have a just transition commissioner in the person of Kieran Mullooly, Mullooly, and he is a part-time just transition commissioner with, I think, no real clout. The just transition team and structure was added on to existing Midland and local authority structures. And in terms of the monies that were there, it seems the department were concerned that monies would not be misappropriated. In Kildare, 5 projects were funded, and 3 of them could loosely be described as community-run enterprises. And I would make the point that they are capable of finding the money they got from Just Transition somewhere else. So one of them is Acdal, which dates back to the closure of the Allenwood Power Station. They got money to extend their business campus. Umra's Peatland Park, which is near Monastravan, got money to look at developing a peatland park on land that Bord na Móna is currently re-wetting. And I have to say, I have a concern around that, in that the community is in a sense taking on responsibility for something that I feel should be the responsibility of Bord na Móna. And with this whole re-wetting program, the PCAS scheme, which is happening across the Midlands, Bord na Móna are doing the minimum to draw down the funding from the department, but there's no long-term strategy to manage these wetlands as far as I can see. And there seems to be the possibility that if the need arises again, they could be dried out, or part of them appropriated for wind farms or solar farms or whatever. Lullymore Heritage Park was the 3rd of the community groups to get funding from the Just Transition Fund. It got money to extend its boardwalk. Now, it's an interesting project. It's in the old Bord na Móna heartland, and it has about 50,000 visitors per annum prior to COVID, and I can see some rationale for funding that. The 2 groups that were, as it were, cross-region, that I find again questionable in terms of why they were funded, was a group called Polysafe. Polysafe used to supply services to the ESB in their power stations, which are now closed, and they came up with an idea to help manage sewage works. Kildare County Council is a partner of this one.
Sorry, your time's coming to an end. If you could start wrapping.
I suppose at the end of the day, what I would say is that we have got feedback from the community who says they would like to see greater emphasis on partnership in proposals as they're developed, and not to have local authorities going off on their own, accessing funding and leaving them out of the equation. They would like to see some form of pre-development funding. They would also want to see a just transition contact person in each county, because local authorities are using the public participation networks to avoid, it seems, dealing with the Bord na Móna communities. And they also reference the lack of engagement with Bord na Móna. And again, the issue here is Bord na Móna seems to have taken the view that they paid off their workers, and that's just transition done and dusted. Just transition, in our experience, is an intensely political process. And unless communities can find mechanisms to work together and influence the process, nothing will change, and they will end up being on the outside and worse off. Okay?
Thanks, Kieran. Yeah, sorry. Thanks, Lawrence. Lawrence, that was really insightful and really good to see a community response and sort of thinking coming from the need for more community engagement in this. If we don't, as you say, we just won't have a transition at all. Yeah. So thanks for that. We've come to the end of our interventions. Thanks for sticking with us. We have an opportunity now to go a little deeper, to share some reflections or insights, even questions. And then we're going to get into a bit of a plenary where we've got a few questions. We go a bit deeper. We are harvesting this. We're taking notes on harvesting this. And we're even going to put some slight edits and updates into the final report, which we'll release. So if people that are online, want to come in, could you go to reactions and put your hand up and just say, I've got a reflection or an insight? You can share it in the chat and we can read it out, or you can come in. There's not too many of us. There's about 40 of us all together and blend in the virtual and online participants. If you're in the room, you need to get the microphone off Caroline if you're going to speak, or you'll not be heard. And I don't know if we can see the room a bit more, if we can zoom out and see the room a bit more here. So thanks for sticking with us, everyone. It was a bit of a marathon there, going through all that. Again, it's all reflected in more depth in the report. So we've shared that link a few times. We can share it again. Just to remind us that this is an event today from Sustainable Projects Ireland, the educational charity that are developing the Ecovillage and supported by the IEN. It's one of two events that build on this report. This afternoon at 2:30, we're going into diversification, farm on, farm off farm, and rural diversification, which is also covered in the report. So has anyone got any insights, reflections they'd like to share, either in the room or online? Now I have to see. So Niamh Garvey, you're very welcome. Do you want to unmute yourself and come in?
Hi, yeah, good morning everyone, and thanks Davy, and congratulations to everyone involved in the report. I've only been skimming it, during the session, but it looks brilliant, and great to hear all the inputs as well. I was really struck. So I guess for a just transition approach, I guess one of the key questions is who's going to be affected, and I was really struck by Fintan's reflection on, I suppose, the suckler herd and the high nature value areas compared to the dairy, and also Bridget, on sort of the intensive farmers versus, I suppose, those engaging in more regenerative or agri-ecological approaches. And I was just keen to maybe hear a little bit more from both of them. I suppose, is the message that you're thinking that the two groups of farmers that you represented should be the primary focus of Just Transition? Or I'd just love to hear a little bit more on the sort of the who in terms of transition based on Bridget and Fintan's comments. Thank you. And again, congratulations to everyone. Thanks.
Want to just respond to that quickly? Sorry, Fintan, do you want to come in there?
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, I think like it was just an example of going through the climate action plan and going through the different scenarios in the carbon budgets document, something that jumped out to me as I suppose a good example of policy failure. So for me, like I tried to outline, there's multiple benefits on putting the onus on the polluter. So there's obviously the polluter pays principle. There's a range of issues around the intensification of the dairy sector. So even if the suckler herd was to destock, and that was, let's say, to address the climate issue, we'd still be left with the air quality issues around ammonia. We'd still be left with all the water quality issues. We'd still be left with the biodiversity issues. And we'd still be, left with the socioeconomic issues around about what happens with all these calves from the dairy herd and how that undermines then the value of beef in the market and how that impacts on the remaining suckler farmers. So for me, it just makes sense that if intensive dairy is the big issue, then that's what we need to address. And then if there's issues after that, then there has to be just transition. And I think, you know, there has to be just transition for those dairy farmers as well, because a lot of them just followed government policy. They just listened to what they were being told to do. Most of them are in massive debt. And, you know, so there has to be just transition for them. They're not necessarily, I'm not trying to pose them as necessarily the bad guys and suckler farmers, the good guys. It's obviously more complex than that. But I suppose just a simplified way that the Climate Change Advisory Council seems to have interpreted the legislation and the economics elements of it, I thought was quite bad. And I thought it was worth kind of presenting it, if even in a kind of simplistic way, you know.
Thanks, Fintan. We'll hear from Bridget here physically, and then we'll go to Charles Stanley Smith. Bridget.
Thanks, Niamh. Yeah, that's a great question. You know, you've got the intensive farmers, or what they call the more productive farmers, and then the extensive farmers or the less productive farmers. Obviously, the agricultural policy at this stage is actually favouring one over the other in terms of all of the supports and the policies and the programs. And that would be for the get big or get out kind of movement. And we're certainly seeing that in the dairy. I mean, the biggest fallouts of farmers aren't actually your smaller suckler farmers. It's actually your smaller dairy farmers that are going out of business. And across Europe, that's been the trend. I think it's really important, though, that if we take one step back and say, what are we doing? And that's feeding people, you know, raising cattle or whatever. The next question has to be how, you know, and those policy considerations have to kind of come in right from the beginning. So the question is, are we going to follow this high external input agriculture, which is being pushed, and as I say, that is the current policy, or are we going to step back and have a look at low external input agriculture and transition to when we start using these words, sustainable, et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, as I say, naturally, your average suckler farmer up and down the Western Seaboard just automatically falls into that low external input category. But like I say, in terms of the distribution of the resources like CAP and all of these dig outs and bailouts that are coming for the pigs or the intensive or the dairy or the fertilizer use, the only supports that aren't coming are for those smaller farmers. So the big question has to be, there are these two different categories of farmers. One has been having an incredibly massive privilege over the other one, and we have to ask that question. Going forward into Ireland, what sort of farmer do we actually want to see on the ground? And the policy has to reflect that.
Brilliant, Bridget. We're going to hear from Charles Stanley Smith. Charles, do you want to come in there? And then we'll hear from Anne B. Ryan in the room. So, Charles.
Hi, thanks, Davey, and thanks, Bridget, for what you just said. I mean, I think that's a very important requirement that we need to work towards in everything we're doing in agriculture. But I have just one simple question is, it's very difficult to keep up with all that's going on, especially here and in Europe and all of that. But there was talk a while back, you know, the European Just Transition Fund, which is separate from what's happening in the Just Transition Fund in the Midlands. That's aimed mainly at Polish miners and the like. There was a move by various EU-based environmental and farming groups to get that extended into farming generally across Europe. Does anybody know what's happening of that? I've lost track of it, I'm afraid. Does anybody know what's happening in that space? Because there was a push to get just transition for European just transition for farming. As I say, I don't know. Does anybody know?
Well, no, don't, Charles. I'd also like to see about what happens there, because there's so much money potentially there for that as well. I mean, there's the land use change and forestry having bigger targets in Ireland and being intimately related to farming as well, means that there's opportunities there as well potentially for this Just Transition Fund, that if it can't go directly into agriculture, that area is important too, because that is the area where forestry is, for example. But I think even the way the carbon tax can be used in Ireland, the way the European Just Transition funds can be used, we have to start using them for transition rather than for propping up the system as it currently is the basic thing I would say on that. But yeah, let's look it up, Charles. I don't know the answer to that yet, about whether it's been extended into ag or not, but here's hoping.
Brilliant, Ollie. We're going to take Anne B. Ryan next here in the studio.
Hi, thanks. Thanks everyone for those great presentations. I suppose I had a couple of things I'm interested that somebody might be able to address. I suppose I'm wondering if anyone has thought about the percentage of the population that should be involved in agriculture. I think in 2000, around the year 2000, I think 7% of the Irish population was involved, and I think that's gone down to maybe 1% now, but not just agriculture, because agriculture is essentially about food. So the percentage that should be involved ideally in a kind of balanced economy, serving society well in both food production and then the allied trades around food, and in that kind of job-rich economy and society that Caroline mentioned. And then I thought it was very interesting what Lawrence was saying about the community responses. And I thought Caroline might like to comment a bit more on where she sees the role of the social wage, including a basic income, in freeing up people's talents, skills that they already have actually in the community, and allowing those to be kind of unleashed. And then finally, maybe something about caps, like nitrogen caps, fossil fuel caps, in a systemic approach would be interesting to hear about if people had any thoughts on that. And maybe it's addressed in the report. I'm afraid I haven't read it yet, so thanks.
Thanks, Anne. That was a good question. The three questions. So the first one, I don't know if Ollie or if any of the ag researchers have something, but maybe we'll start with the question to Caroline. Caroline, do you want to take that question from Anne?
Sure, thank you. I remember there was a question about caps, but I'm afraid I forgot the other one. Sorry, what was the other one?
The percentage of the population and
That's the one, yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'll start with the caps. So yeah, like I mentioned earlier, I think regulation has a really primary role to play, and we can't be just relying on price to achieve the ecological transition. So some of these regulations, I think it's very important to focus as much as possible at the supply end, to look upstream, because if you can tackle these things at the source, it's going to affect every single part of the economy. It's going to affect every part of the supply chain, all the parts of the value chain, all of that. So, for example, there's this joint paper, which I'm sure a lot of you are aware of, that Swan, SCC, and the Pillar put out last year. And one of the things it calls for is a cap on the supply of reactive synthetic nitrogen, because that's really a central thing, central component, an input in high input agriculture. And if there's a hard limit put on that and it's phased out gradually over time, that's going to have an enormous effect on it's going to basically pressure farming to diversify in a particular way. So it's sort of a source-based approach, if you like. And then a wider intervention, which we in FASTA are very interested in, is the idea of having a cap on the overall fossil fuel supply. And that's a massive intervention, because that would affect all sectors of the economy, in fact. And there's quite a few people thinking in these terms now. We've put a lot of thought into it, and so have various other people, and we have quite a bit of work done on that. It could be done as, for us, a good way to approach it would be actually to do it at EU level, and to do it in a partnership with global South countries, which could include Brazil, which is interesting because there's a lot of talk about Brazil and beef exports from Brazil and all that stuff, and so I mean there's an awful lot of potential there. There's a lot of people in Brazil who are not into the beef industry at all and are interested in this kind of thing, and we have some contacts there. So anyway, I think there's a potential it's good to think in this kind of holistic way, and to think about the sorts of regulations that could be implemented that would really affect the whole economy. There's also other regulations needed, like biodiversity strengthening. There's EU law that needs to be brought in there. There's some really important measures that need to be taken. But like I say, regulation is very, very important. Can't just rely on price. And then in terms of universal basic income, just very quickly, if we can create economic circumstances that make it easier for people to experiment and try new things, to go into farming if that interests them, to have access to farming, to have access to housing in rural areas, just to change the goalposts, make all of that kind of thing easier. It's a game changer, I think, and it just. Everybody has ideas, everybody needs a chance to try out different things. As Lawrence mentioned earlier, I thought that was a brilliant comment that, the skills that are lacking are in the agencies, the policymakers, they're the ones who are lacking skills in a sense. I think people on the ground have an enormous wealth of ideas, but they need to have the chance to put them into practice and to try different things and to have the freedom, to have the wiggle room to try different things. So that's partly why we're so interested in things like UBI and the strengthened social wage, to create that kind of protective floor that enables more wiggle room. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. That was great, and thanks, Anne, for the question. Lenny, before you come in, I just want to start to plant the seed for what we want to maybe try and gather in this plenary. We really want to look at what is missing. Okay, you've not seen or be able to digest the full report yet. There's a lot in there, but even from what we've heard today, what's missing? And how might we accelerate a just transition in the way that we've been framing it today? So that's where we want to go. Please indicate you want to come in, or if you're here, just put your hand up and we'll bring you in. But Lenny, over to you. Lenny was also one of the authors of the report. Lenny.
Yeah, thanks. I suppose one of the things that we kept hearing about when we were writing the report was, about the importance of involving communities in decisions that affect them, and it just strikes me that that's something that we're still really bad at, and that we don't have the kind of I suppose democratic infrastructure in place for. Whether it's, I suppose one thing, I'm from Galway, and there was kind of a very bitter row earlier this year about building a cycle lane in Galway, and it just it was really, we still have this model of whether it's councils or national government proposing policy and then coming along and saying, okay, we're going to do a public consultation, and then you have a few weeks to send in your submissions or whatever, and then people's submissions usually sometimes they're ignored, sometimes they're not, but it's kind of far from participative process. And I was reading a bit about the cycle lane that was built along the coast in Dunleary Rathdown, and I know that that constituency is a bit of an outlier, kind of socio-economically, but I was reading about how the council went around to every single door along the route of the cycle lane to try to collect concerns from people and to hear about their views and what might need to change. And that struck me as a real outlier in terms of the level of engagement and genuine sort of participative engagement. So I think if we are serious about a just transition, we need to kind of almost build up from scratch the kind of apparatus of how we engage communities in decision making, because right now we're just not very good at it. That's all.
Thanks for the insight. Iva, I can almost see you here where you are, so I'll hand over for your insight or your reflection.
Thanks, Davey. Yeah, thanks everybody for all your presentations and for the report. I'm really looking forward to reading it properly. Just a couple of observations and maybe one question. Like, it's kind of picking up. I really appreciate the way that with your inputs, we've been looking at very much kind of zooming back and looking at a kind of global or European level view. Caroline's comments.
Iva, we're having difficulties hearing you. Could you just hold the microphone?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, and don't move it. Don't move, Chris.
Don't move.
Perfect.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. So I was really appreciative of all the presentations, and I'm really looking forward to reading the report. Thank you. And it's really great to hear from people who are like Caroline White mentioning, looking at a global level, kind of zooming out, looking very much from a global level, and then getting down to the kind of level that Olive referred to when it comes to the suggestion from St. Vincent de Paul that what we need is community, community energy advisors. And I think that picks up for me on Lenny's comments that, in many ways, like this just transition comes down to having individual conversations with individual people and not relying on those conversations being done by overstretched, underfunded community groups that rely on volunteers. So I'm intrigued by this idea that we need to basically have people whose sole role and their way of making a living is to go around and to support people and to help them understand what supports are actually there. It's so simple that it gets missed, and I'm really interested to know, Olive, in any research that you do at a rural level. The other comment that I have is with regard to the conversations that are happening within the farming community. And I mean, just on my kind of brief look at this whole area, which I don't know a huge amount about, is that we somehow, there are conversations that aren't happening between so-called normal farmers and those of us maybe coming to an event like this. And that is not, it's not a criticism, it's more just an observation. And I wonder, how can we, in Ireland, how can we crack open these conversations? Because we've got the IFA, we've got the Farmers Journal, we've got like a very strong industrial farming lobby group, and then we've got farmers who are self-employed, individuals who feel the weight of uncertainty on their shoulders, and then they feel like the burden of, we're the bad guys environmentally. So, how do you begin to have conversations so that you can kind of crack through the messaging of the IFA and actually talk to people? Those are just a couple of observations. Thank you.
Thanks, Iva. Really good for community support and not just voluntary support to catalyze, to give that mentorship to community groups as they make the transition. Obviously, the social dialogue is really important, and the Just Transition Commission, or the Just Transition Alliance, the new quite groundbreaking alliance between the trade unions and environmentalists that has just launched recently, really puts that social dialogue and that engagement with communities at the forefront. But maybe Ollie, for the other pieces that Iva talked about engaging farmers and...
Yeah, so it is a tough nut to crack in some ways, for sure. But I mean, in the report, we do have a contribution from the Irish Natura and Hill Farmers Association and from the ICMSA. So, that's probably a step for us as well, to be fair, that we actually did make an effort to more step outside of just working with kindred groups. But to be honest, like getting environmental groups and farmer groups together, even agroecological farmer groups together, there's work there to be done as well, that they don't necessarily all sing from the same hymn sheet anyway. So getting those groups together, which we're doing tomorrow in Feeding Ourselves in particular, that's important. And we did make an effort to bring in, farmer groups into the report itself. And, and we did a land care event here as well a couple of years ago, where we also had the local IFA and Duncan Stewart and Teresa from FASTA actually as well on the same table. So we do try to do that, but there's like 550 lobby meetings in the Department of Agriculture in a year, and they only had to send 730 emails. I thought that was amazing. That that's the access level. That when I think of how many emails I send. So there's a tiny environmental sector. It's vanishingly small, And I think people are really surprised sometimes when they hear how few staff there actually are in environmental groups combined in Ireland. And so the level of work that needs to be done and the number of people to do it is, there's such a big gap. But just to finish on that, what you were saying about, energy consultants kind of for communities, it's a brilliant idea. And it really reminds me a lot of what Leader started out as with the animators. And Leader still has animators. And me and Lawrence were talking yesterday as well about, for all the flaws with Leader and so on, at least there are these people to help in the Leader system, because Leader came from the ground up. It came from communities coming together to try and help themselves. So we do need to create this kind of almost new sector of people who animate and liaise and capacity build, because capacities and capabilities kept coming up for what Just Transition needs. And that model from Leader, which was kind of, damaged a lot by government policy and changes, like it made it overly bureaucratic in recent years. There's still the kernel of a really good approach there. The communities are helped by people in their community. So Sean O'Farrell, for example, is a farmer we work with a lot over in Moneygall. He's now an animator for Leader on renewable energy, biodiversity and water. And that's a new role that he has. And that's the thing that needs to happen more and more and more to make it possible for communities to transition, as was clear from Olive's presentation and from, chatting with and so on. We do need to do more, but as you know, we do put in a lot of hours.
Thanks, Ollie. Thanks, Iva, for that prompt. Let's go back to Laura.
I suppose I want to maybe echo that point about the dialogue and getting out and talking to people. There's no shortcut here. And if people have been ignored or not brought into the conversation in the past, you've got to work to bring them in. Here in Kildare, we actually are working with Leader to get Leader to take on a role around just transition. It has the capacities. Now, it has been gelded, for want of a better word, by bureaucracy and the requirements of the Department of Agriculture over the last number of years. But it's the only body that actually has the potential to lead the conversation locally and that has certain standing that people respect it. So the dialogue part of all of this, to getting people on board, it is not a once-off thing. It's something that has to keep being repeated and being repeated and being repeated. But maybe the task is to persuade the leaders and similar organizations to do that work and do it more effectively than they have been in the last while. Okay.
Lawrence, thanks, Lawrence. We're coming to the end. A few people just arrived, so you're very welcome if you've just arrived. We're discussing the report. I put the report link again into the chat, and we're looking at the just transition elements this morning. This afternoon, we'll be looking at diversification. Bridget, you want to come in to respond?
I just wanted to answer something very specific around engaging with communities, or when you're talking about engaging with farmers. And the one thing is to say that historically our the farm representative organizations have a particular style, and it followed what we would have seen in national politics, that idea of I'll look after you. You give me your vote, we'll make sure that you're looked after. And we saw that. We've seen that over kind of like the last number of decades, the fishing industry being thrown under the bus, and then the sugar industry, the sugar beet industry, and then, say, for example, now the squeeze on the sucklers. But that style of representation of people, I think, is no longer fit for purpose. But following on from that, we talk, say, for example, Lenny's idea about the greenways, for example, the rewetting of the bogs. I would be a hill farmer. The stakeholders or the people that are being consulted of this would be local communities. They're not talking to the landowners. The reality is the transitions, what is going to happen on a farmer's private land. And I think you need to bring those farmers in at a very early stage to start landscaping what those kind of like transitions, what those developments, what those things are going to be. But essentially what we have at the moment is that the engagement brings in the landowners at the point where the projects and the schemes or whatever have already been designed, and then it's to try and buy them in. And I think that we need to bring the people who actually own those resources in a lot earlier if you want them to be part of that.
Thanks, Bridget. We have come to the end of this session. It was a slightly longer session than we normally do with virtual, but we blended it with our participants and our physical participants here in the studio in the WeCreate workplace in the village. I'm going to hand over to Ollie for some closing remarks, and then we'll look at our next steps. So, Ollie.
Yeah, so thanks, Davey. Thanks for facilitating as well and for keeping us on track and on time as usual. So, yeah, and thanks to Michelle and Lenny for the work on the report. It's been great to get it out, and I'd encourage people to have a read of it. It's there in the chat and it's on the ARC website and so on. Thanks to my employers, ARC 2020, for funding it, along with UCC Centre for Cooperative Studies, and to Cloughjordan Ecovillage, Sustainable Projects Ireland, and to Cultivate for this event and the next event, which is on this afternoon. So this event here was with the Ecovillage, and this afternoon then the diversification event will be with Cultivate. So you're more than welcome to come along to that as well. Sign up if you haven't already. You can do so on the Cultivate website, that's cultivate.ie. And and thanks to everyone for the contributions today and in the report. So over to you, Davey.
Well, thanks, Ollie. So again, just on behalf of Sustainable Projects Ireland, the educational charity that are developing the Ecovillage, thanks for coming to today's session and engaging in today's session. Ollie didn't mention tomorrow, which is our big day, which is our annual Feeding Ourselves event, which really is a movement builder with the regenerative farmers in Tullibeo, the food co-ops, the food hubs on the Open Food Network, and the members of the Open Training Network, which is a new network building capacity in the sort of regenerative, community-led, cooperative, local food sector, which is hugely under-resourced and underrepresented. And that's what we're doing with this report. Our work with ARC is to try and get more representation for that unique sector in this just transition and in the diversification that we need to make. So again, we're starting at 2:30 again this afternoon with diversification. Hopefully you might be able to join us. Thanks again to all the speakers and the contributors in the room and online. Thank you.